Thank you. So I'd like to start out by just telling you about two young women that I've met along the way. Their stories are very different, but I'm going to focus on what connects those stories because it's those connections that get us to the heart of human trafficking. And then I'm going to shift the focus a little bit to talk about what connects us to the stories of human trafficking, because I think that gets us to the heart of the things that we can do to make a difference. So the first woman was Butri. She was living in Thailand with her family when she was chosen by her family to be the one who would go overseas and make money for the family, sending money back. Her family took out a huge loan in order for her to get accepted by the recruitment agency. They were told that Butri would earn this money back in just a few short months, and then she'd be making all kinds of money to send home to the family. She would have the loan paid off in no time. When Butri arrived at the airport, she was accompanied by 7 other Thai workers. They all arrived under the Temporary Foreign Worker Program. At the airport, they saw the contractor whom they had first met at the recruitment office in Thailand. So they went with him, they all got into the van. At the first stop along the way, 7 of the workers were told to get out, and they went to the farm that was on their contract. That's where they would be working. Butri was told to stay in the van, and the van continued to drive on for quite some time and finally went to an old dilapidated farmhouse where she was taken inside and told she would be sleeping there. There were 10 other people on mattresses on the bare floor. That was her introduction to Canada. The next morning, Butri got in a van with these other workers in the house, and they were taken to a farm to work. That's when Butri first realized that the contract that she had signed was not a legitimate contract. She was not at the place of work that was on her contract. Instead, she was being shuttled around from farm to farm to be an extra supply worker, if you will. She was never sure what conditions she would be working in and never sure what she would be paid. In fact, sometimes she worked for as little as $7 a day. The one thing she knew is that she would never get the loan paid off at this rate. When Butri complained, she was told to be quiet because she was here illegally. And if she said anything to anyone, she would be deported. Only then did Butri fully appreciate that she had been deceived by the contractor. Still, she kept quiet and did the work as she was told, because there was no way that she could go back to her family without having the money to pay back the loan. So that's one example of human trafficking that takes place fairly often in Canada and in fact in southwestern Ontario. Here's another example. Melissa was 14 years old when she met Rick. Although he was 4 years older than she was, Rick seemed very interested in her, and Melissa enjoyed the time she spent with him. It was a welcome relief from her stressed out mom and from her annoying little sister. With no close friends of her own, Melissa was thrilled every time that Rick told her that he loved her. She could hardly believe her good fortune when he bought her gifts of jewelry, clothing, and took her on trips. Soon Melissa started spending nights at Rick's place, and it was wonderful for a few weeks. Then Rick told her about his financial problems. He said that she owed him money for the gifts that he had given her, and he pushed Melissa to have sex with his friends as a way to make money. Then he started to press her to have sex at the hotels in the city with strangers. When she refused, he beat her until she agreed. Soon Melissa was forced to have sex every day and to hand the money over to Rick. She was too ashamed to call anyone for help. The first story, Butri's story, is an example of international trafficking, with different elements of the crime taking place in different countries. And it's trafficking for the purpose of labor exploitation. Melissa's is an example of domestic trafficking, with all of the elements of the crime taking place in Canada. And of course, it's for the purpose of sexual exploitation. But one of the things that connects these two stories is that they both have three interrelated elements. Both Boutry and Melissa were recruited by deceptive and coercive means. They were then put in situations where they could be controlled by a number of different measures, and they were controlled for the purpose of exploitation, exploited for profit. Boutry was deceived about the job in Canada, and once here, she was controlled by her inability to speak English, her fear of being deported, and her fear for her family if she wasn't able to pay back the loan that they had taken out. Melissa was recruited by Rick through manipulation, then controlled through violence, stigma, and shaming. Traffickers are master manipulators who use combinations of violence, deception, and reward to make people feel trapped. The exploitation that's at the core of human trafficking can take many different forms. It can be sexual exploitation, whether being exploited by a partner or in the sex trade. It can be labor exploitation in the service industries. We see it in restaurants and hotels, in the agricultural sector, in fields and greenhouses, in domestic work, nannies, personal care workers, and housekeepers, and manual labor in the construction industry and food processing. We also see it among some people who are out begging in the streets. And finally, some people are trafficked for their organs. In the end, no matter what it looks like, it's all about exploiting people for profit. So those are some of the things that connect the stories of Boutry and Melissa. But what connects us to those stories? For starters, human trafficking is exposing our failures as a society, because it's social and economic exclusion that make people vulnerable to being trafficked. Many people experience exclusion due to barriers such as poverty, gender bias, racism, lack of education, lack of opportunity. Others become excluded as a result of mental illness, addiction, family disconnection, or social isolation. One's risk of being trafficked also increases if one belongs to a stigmatized group, whether it's a cultural group or an ethnic group. With regard to people who are trafficked internationally, restrictive immigration policies often push people into desperate circumstances. They take precarious migration routes in search of safety or in search of viable employment. And these journeys too easily devolve into situations of human trafficking. In Boutry's case, she was also affected by the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, a policy in Canada. In this program, work permits tie a migrant worker to a specific employer. When the contractor didn't take Boutry to the work that was listed on her contract, to the place of employment on her contract, she found herself thrust into an illegal situation through no fault of her own. Her lack of English, unfamiliarity with the laws in Canada also magnified her vulnerability. In other cases, some migrant workers are abused at their place of work, and this same rule, these tied work permits, leave them vulnerable to this abuse because they can't readily change employers. And what about trafficking that takes place entirely within Canada? Well, we know that Indigenous women and girls can be particularly vulnerable to being trafficked because they often experience multiple social and economic barriers intersecting in their lives. A 2014 Public Safety Canada report concluded that Indigenous women and girls are at greater risk of being trafficked because they are more likely to live in poverty, as well as suffer from drug addiction and mental health issues. But here's the most important piece of the report. The authors make connections between Canada's colonial history, intergenerational residential school attendance, and these increased risks of being trafficked. So, as much as we need to arrest and prosecute the traffickers and any others who benefit from these crimes, we also need to acknowledge that collectively we are connected to these cases of human trafficking because we allow these social and economic situations to persist. And we allow our governments to maintain policies that leave people more vulnerable to being trafficked. Human trafficking is challenging us as a society to evolve into something better, into a society of compassion and justice. And this is where we together can make a difference. Don't let the struggle around human trafficking be narrowed to simplistically trying to catch the bad guys. Together we can keep the focus wider. We can work for greater protection for those who have been trafficked. And just as important, we can work together to urge our governments to respond to the underlying social and economic exclusion that leave far too many people vulnerable to being trafficked. Thank you.